Hi everyone. In this week 9 lecture, we're going to be talking about some theories of organizational leadership and then challenges facing human service organizations moving forward. So what is leadership? This is probably something that most of us have some ideas about and might be able to lend a definition to, but believe it or not, there's an entire sort of academic literature that actually studies leadership, and that's where this definition is drawn from. In fact, that's where much of this week's lecture content is drawn from. So leadership can be thought of as the ability to influence a group of people working towards a common vision or a common set of goals. Maybe a mission, you could sort of incorporate mission statement in there if you wanted to, but some superordinate sort of vision or principle or something like that. A little more behaviorally speaking, leadership is the manner and approach of providing direction, implementing goals, and motivating people. Now, most of the time, leaders in human service organizations are sort of set up structurally to lead. So the position that they hold is sort of elevated above the group of people that they manage or that they provide leadership to. There are sort of informal leaders. If you ever read the article Street Level Bureaucrats in a policy class or something like that, there certainly are people who are leading from non-leadership kinds of positions. They might be thought leaders or opinion leaders, and that happens. Those thought or opinion leaders occur because people have experience or wisdom or certain kinds of qualifications or something like that. But in general, in this lecture, when I talk about leadership, what I'm going to be talking about is really people who have a formal leadership role in an organization. So their position requires them to lead. A portion of their job duties require them to lead or manage, or sort of whatever verb you want to think about here. But there's sort of a formal leadership as opposed to informal leadership. So a couple of competing theories of leadership. One says that leaders are born. This is called the trait theory of leadership. It's sort of innate. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, there's no way you're going to get it. That's I don't know, doesn't necessarily seem consistent with social work principles to me. So there's sort of a competing theory of leadership that says that leadership is learned or that leaders are made. This is really a behavioral theory of leadership, and this is the one that we'll be talking about primarily in this lecture. Now, when some people talk about leaders who are born, they might be suggesting that leaders have a certain degree of charisma, a certain ability to maybe speak well in public and cultivate a following, cultivate interest. They're charismatic, as I've already said, and that certainly there are leaders in history who certainly were born, right? Who certainly were born with the traits of being leaders. Certain dictators or politicians certainly come to mind. But really, given the kinds of tasks that leaders of nonprofits are asked to do, which we'll be talking about during the course of this lecture, it's more likely that leaders of human service organizations are made. They learn sort of the behaviors needed to effectively lead human service and social work organizations. And so that's what we're going to, that's what we'll sort of emphasize during the course of this lecture here. And I certainly would argue that that social work in general takes a behavioral view of a lot of things. We learn behaviors and we can unlearn behaviors. That's a big premise of a lot of our work. And so you can learn positive things and you can unlearn negative things. And so it would seem to square with sort of the general view of social work that a behavioral theory of leadership is much more consistent with sort of the values of our profession. So second theory of leadership that I'm going to introduce you to. So this is the first. there's a trait theory of leadership and a behavioral theory of leadership. Second one is this idea of, transactional and transformational leadership. Transactional leadership, transactional leaders guide or motivate their followers in a direction that they, the leaders, establish. So you directed actions, you reward achievements, you threaten failure, punish failures, and that's why here in the here in the parentheses here, what I said was that transactional leaders motivate or threaten people to do something that that they, the leaders, specify. Little hint of what's coming up here. Transactional leadership, it sort of fits very well with classical organization theory. The boss is the boss for a reason, because he or she holds a certain degree of expertise and knowledge. The worker is the worker because he or she doesn't have that knowledge, and the worker has to behave and do what it is the leader says, because the leader knows best, and there's a single best way to accomplish a specific task. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, is providing inspiration and a sense of direction, but letting employees or workers get to that end point in the manner that they best deem fit. Transformational leadership builds on the strengths of individual employees. It provides them with a certain degree of independence and sort of views them as capable and competent creatures. This theory of leadership is set up as kind of an all or nothing, right? Either you're entirely transactional or you're entirely transformational. And it's really not that that cut and dry. That it's really not that binary. Good, effective leaders probably do a mix of transactional leadership and transformational leadership, and they deploy one style when it suits the task at hand. So, for example, you might deploy a transactional leadership style when there's sort of a really procedural task that has to be done, say filing a report with a regulator, right? In that sense, that isn't a task that necessarily calls for innovation and free thinking. It's just something that sort of has to be done, and it would be very easy for a leader to teach an employee how to do that particular process, to coach them through it, to reward them for their achievements, sanction them if necessary for failures, and if not sanction, then sort of reframe those failures so that the task is done. And like I said, that's something that's a task that probably calls for a transactional form of leadership. The kinds of change that we've been talking about here probably calls for a transformational leadership. So, like I said, leaders probably are able to move back and forth between the two styles depending on sort of the task at hand. It might be reasonable to say that in general most leaders are transformational. 60% of the time they're transformational. The remaining 40% of the time they're transactional, or something like that. So you certainly could have a trait that's more pronounced than one or the other. But transactional leadership isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's really only a bad thing if that's the only style of leadership a leader is capable of. So as I said before, transactional leadership probably lends itself to a classical organization theory. And if you remember way back in the beginning of the semester, talking about Frederick Winslow Taylor, he said that there was a single best way to do things. And in the example that we used here in class, that was to load pig iron steel, whatever it was, onto a railroad container in a particular way. That's a very transactional form of leadership. There's a best way to do it, the leader says what the best way is, and you better stick to what it is the leader says, or there are consequences or an absence of rewards. Really, the transformational style of leadership emerged as companies grew, as organizations grew, as things became more complex. And so neoclassical theory, remember, started to think about sort of the human dimensions of organizations, and people use their interactions with organizations to get personal needs fulfilled. So that lends itself much more to sort of transformational leadership, as does sort of thinking about systems theories, where processes are complex and creativity can be rewarded, things like that. We probably also should spend just a second talking about leadership and organizational change. I'm just going to move myself up here so we can so you can see all the words on the screen here. So in the past couple of weeks, we've talked about sort of two different types of change: revolutionary change and evolutionary change. I would make the argument that transformational leadership is sort of what's needed when the change confronting an organization is revolutionary, when there's a lot of upheaval. And I would also argue that although transactional leadership can be important in evolutionary change, transformational leadership can help make those evolutionary kinds of changes more successful. So if you remember, evolutionary change was sort of the boring day-to-day changes that an organization has to go through. It doesn't sort of throw the entire system into chaos, but it sort of is the incremental forms of change that organizations are confronted with. And as I said, transformational leadership, that should say transformational, not transformation. Transformation is not always better. There are sort of simple behavioral tasks that just sort of lend themselves to transactional leadership, and that's okay. As I said, it's probably best for a leader to be able to move in and out of transactional leadership and transformational leadership as situations dictate, or as circumstances dictate. There's also kind of, so if we're talking about different kinds of leaders, there's sort of three different kinds of leaders: authoritarian, democratic, and delegative. Delegative, obviously the word comes from delegate, right? So someone who delegates their decision-making authority. So in an authoritarian style of leadership, there's often clear expectations, very clear divisions between who's in the position of leadership and who's not. Those leaders are often making independent decisions, and there's a risk that they come across as bossy or dictatorial, like a dictator. Okay. Democratic leaders give guidance and encourage participation. They receive and act on input from group members, and delegative leaders really don't give guidance or give minimal guidance. They let people act as they would, however they need to, as long as it is that they're accomplishing tasks. And one of the issues, of course, with delegative leadership is that roles can be poorly defined. Groups may lack motivation. There's not necessarily a lot of contact with leadership. And again, one of these is not necessarily better than the other, although I would hazard to guess that most social work leaders are democratic and delegative by nature. Good leaders are able to sort of move in between these three styles as circumstances dictate. And so part of what sort of makes a leader a good leader is knowing which style of leadership, transactional or transformational, is sort of most appropriate in this situation, and which style of leadership, authoritarian, democratic, or delegative, is sort of best in a particular moment. There is a big literature on sort of the qualities of good leaders. Good leaders possess vision and integrity, dedication. They are magnanimous. Magnanimity is a tough word to pronounce. They're magnanimous, right? So they're charismatic, and there are also a ton of typos on this. Holy cow! So this should say humility, and this should say fairness. Instead, what I've written is humility and fairness. I was doing this very quickly, as you may imagine. But good leaders are humble. They're open. They're creative. They're fair. But they're also assertive, and they possess a sense of humor. Good leaders are people that people can trust and believe in, and they're also people that others want to be around, right? So they enjoy learning from them. They enjoy hearing them speak, and they have an appreciation and they value sort of what it is the course that they're setting for an organization. One of the big theories to emerge in leadership recently is a field called emotional intelligence. And there's a lot of work being done in lots of different fields. But emotional intelligence was sort of originally developed by a man named Daniel Goleman. He was a psychologist. He is a psychologist interested in business psychology, organizational psychology, that kinds of thing. I actually do emotional intelligence work in substance use, and so, like I said, it's been, although that work didn't necessarily come from Daniel Goleman, the ideas of emotional intelligence have been sort of making their way around the social science field recently. So Goleman tells us that there's sort of 5 components of emotional intelligence, or EI. That's what that abbreviation is there: self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill. Let's just talk about each of these real quick. So Goleman tells us that good leaders are self-aware. They understand their own emotions. They understand their own strengths, their weaknesses, needs, and drives. They're not overly critical. They're realistically hopeful. They're not sort of Pollyanna-ish, which is if you're Pollyanna, you're sort of overly optimistic, overly hopeful. Never see bad in anything or any situation. And although that's nice sometimes, that's not always what's called for. So if you're self-aware, you're sort of hopeful in realistic terms. You're honest with yourself. You speak openly and accurately about how one's own emotions impact work, and appropriately self-confident, not overly self-confident. And then people who are self-aware appreciate and desire constructive criticism, or criticism that helps them grow. So the second component of emotional intelligence is this ability to self-regulate. And that's really the ability to label and identify and label emotions, and then channel them into useful ways. And this is actually sort of what we're interested in the substance use world. We want people to be able to experience unpleasant emotions, which are an unavoidable fact of life, and respond to them in constructive ways as opposed to destructive ways, which often manifests itself as substance use. At any rate, the reason I'm mentioning that is just because I think it's interesting that there's a parallel between sort of the organizational leadership world and these other parts of the social science academic world. So people who are able to self-regulate are often reflective and thoughtful. They're comfortable with ambiguity. They're comfortable with change. They're able to sort of foster trust and fairness among people around them. But Goleman tells us that self-regulated leaders attract employees, and they're able to hold on to them, and they sort of act act with a lot of integrity. Motivation is next, and that's sort of this intrinsic drive to achieve and exceed expectations. So people who are highly motivated have a passion for the work, and they believe in the mission or the vision of the organization. They have a love of learning, a dissatisfaction with the status quo. They're interested in innovative approaches to work, and they're of course comfortable with implementing those innovative approaches. They're interested in tracking performance, and they're sort of optimistic. Again, not overly Pollyanna, but but appropriately optimistic. Empathy was the fourth of five of Goleman's dimensions of emotional intelligence. So if you're empathic, you're able to detect feelings in other people and understand how those feelings are impacting them. Empathy is pretty easily recognizable. It has sort of a je ne sais quoi about it, but it's the work that Daniel Goleman is doing increasingly says that empathy is an incredibly important leadership quality. Goleman then also tells us that this idea of social skill, which he originally had labeled as sort of the fifth dimension, but he kind of is now talking about it as sort of this superordinate organizing principle. So people who possess all four of the other dimensions that we're talking about also tend to have a lot of social skill, and so he thinks that these other things sort of inform someone's social skill. And so if you're a leader with social skill, you can think of it as friendliness with a purpose. You're able to find common ground with others, build rapport, motivate people towards a common goal, that kind of thing. I think it's important to talk about leadership and trauma-informed care as well. We obviously had talked about trauma-informed care at a couple of points during the different couple of parts of the semester. But I'm increasingly thinking that trauma-informed care can be thought of as a really a theory of leadership, much the same way that emotional intelligence can be thought of as a theory of leadership. And so it's really a behavioral theory, right? And so the 5 principles of trauma-informed care sort of suggest a behavioral repertoire for and really a set of goals for leaders to operationalize in their day-to-day activities. So good leaders ensure the safety of people around them. They welcome new ideas. They would never respond to someone posing an idea with something outrageous like, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," or "That's a terrible idea." They encourage that kind of criticism and feedback. Good leaders behave transparently, and they explain the decisions that they're making. They explain, why they made a certain decision and why they did not make another decision. They encourage collaboration, right? That's that democratic style of leadership. They give choices, right? That's that transformational style of leadership, and they empower others. Again, that sort of transformational style of leadership. That got me to thinking and really asking, is transactional leadership trauma-informed? I don't know. This would be an interesting, this is an interesting thing to kind of think about. Transactional leadership, because it's sort of classical, it sort of aligns itself with classical organization theory, almost by definition sort of doesn't offer choice. And although it rewards achievement, it would punish punish not achieving, or it would punish failure, and that's sort of antithetical to the nature of trauma-informed care. So, I'm wondering, as I've said during the course of this lecture, there are times when transactional leadership is what's called for. So how do we, how would we make transactional leadership trauma-informed to the extent that it could be? Like I said, something worth kind of thinking about, especially as trauma-informed care sort of makes its way more and more and takes up more of the sort of space in the social work world right now. So let's move into sort of the last stage of this lecture and talk about some of the challenges for nonprofits. Funding. So these are sort of perennial challenges, and maybe this isn't necessarily new information, but nonprofits haven't always struggled with these kinds of things. It's really only in the past 20 or 25 years, maybe 30 years, that they really have started to struggle with these kinds of things. And of course, funding is going to be a big challenge, especially recently with the COVID outbreak. COVID has increased requests for services. It's decreased, funding levels and donations, and that's as states realize lower revenues because taxes tax revenues are declining. Sales tax, people aren't spending as much, and so coffers for government coffers are smaller than they would be. And then, of course, when the economy sort of goes down, people donate less. And that's just sort of a fact of nonprofit life. So economic downturns are really hard on nonprofits because not only are requests for services going up typically, but funding levels and donations are decreasing. Second challenge for nonprofits are changes in government philosophy. And so the question to think about here is really one in terms of politics. People on the conservative side of the spectrum think that the market should be what allocates resources, what determines resources. People on the liberal or democratic side of things tend to think that the government has to regulate markets and do an awful lot to ensure sort of a basic standard of living. So whose responsibility is it to provide or ensure a basic standard of living? If you're on the Democratic side of things, you would tend to say that it's the government's job to ensure some basic standard of living. If you're on the conservative or Republican side of things, you would tend to say that it's up to the individual to ensure a basic standard of living. And if for some reason someone doesn't have a basic standard of living, well, that's on them, not anyone else. That's their fault, not anyone else. So one of the things that we hear an awful lot about now is this term called the welfare state. A welfare state is not necessarily a bad thing. That simply means that the state, the government, right, state writ large, or government, could be the federal government, could be the state government, or it could even be local government. But the welfare state refers to some level of government involvement in providing sort of basic standards of living. So if tax cuts, for example, would be one way that the government can provide for the welfare of people, right? Tax cuts are one way to put more money in people's pockets. The stimulus checks that some people got during the COVID outbreak is another function of the welfare state. That was the government taking care of people's needs, even though that was temporary and only sort of a one-time thing. Nevertheless, human services are an important sort of arm of the welfare state. As I said, the welfare state isn't necessarily a bad thing. I guess that depends on sort of a person's political orientation. The consumer orientation, or sort of the orientation towards consumerism, is also sort of a challenge for nonprofits. So increasingly, funders want to know if clients are satisfied with their services, and that's fine. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of what social workers are doing doesn't necessarily lend itself to client satisfaction. The best example I can think of is sort of from my own work. In substance abuse treatment, we're often asking clients to do things they don't want to do, and so although they know that reducing or eliminating drinking or drugging is right for them, they're often unhappy with us because we've asked them to do it. So we have good outcomes, but not necessarily high levels of client satisfaction. Nevertheless, that's just sort of something that's permeating the world right now, and that's a challenge that nonprofits have to respond to. And of course, accountability is another sort of challenge for nonprofits. Most social workers have some expertise with program evaluation. They're able to demonstrate what it is they did with the resources they were given. And then the final challenge that we'll talk about is the sort of pressure to move towards being a truly open system, and that manifests itself in agencies being able to accommodate a wider variety of clients, respond to a wider variety of needs, and respond when government programs are shut down or exceed capacity or something like that. Leadership, sort of what are social work leaders going to need to be able to do in the future? That often manifests itself as boards looking for sort of the personality traits of a leader coupled with specific skill or experience. And I've listed a few of those things here. Fundraising would be a specific skill or specific experience. Navigating mergers, grant writing, program evaluation, fiscal management, sort of getting an organization out of debt, or moving an organization towards a place where it's sort of financially healthy, and strategic planning. So these are sort of specific skills that some leaders cultivate in order to set themselves up for success in certain kinds of jobs. Lastly, I'll just sort of tie this conversation back to Abramovitz and the New Public Management podcast from a couple of weeks ago. If you remember, Abramovitz tells us that leaders of human service organizations are increasingly educated as lawyers, or they possess MBAs or MPAs, and they're not necessarily MSWs. Quick aside, what's an MPA? An MPA is a Master of Public Administration. It's sort of the MBA equivalent to human service, nonprofit, government, public sector kind of work. And Abramovitz in that podcast says that MSWs need to sort of reclaim leadership. Well, so how do we do that, right? What are our steps? One is to seek mentorship and to find a mentor who's a leader and start to interact with that person, learn from him or her. Even better than having just one mentor is having a team of mentors. There's nothing that says you can't have a group of mentors, right? You can't be mentored by more than one person. You could take trainings, right? Some trainings are a day, or a couple of days or a week or something like that. In this COVID world, some trainings are sort of hour-long webinars and things like that. But there's ways to sort of concretely increase your skills, right? Take trainings. It may be that some social workers pursue joint degrees. They pursue a JD or an MBA or an MPA, and although that's a good idea, education's expensive and takes a lot of time. And so I wonder if that'll be some of the ways that MSWs start to reclaim leadership space in some organization. Another thing that social workers, MSWs, can do is take on leadership roles, even if it's in the context of a project or leading a committee, leading a small team for a short amount of time. And then, of course, sort of the big behavioral thing that we need to be able to do is apply for, be competitive, and accept or assume formal positions of leadership in those agencies. And once we're doing that, we need to be mentoring younger social workers, right, younger MSWs into positions of leadership as well. Of course, it's important for us to reflect on our growing leadership skills and then sort of remember that the MSW really trains us for a wide variety of roles. I mean, the MSW is a generalist degree, so yes, it absolutely trains us for clinical work. It absolutely trains us for community work and macro work. It also trains us for leadership work as well. And so, as you can see here, what I'm attempting to do is create some, or leave you with some inspiration in this lecture, and hope that you'll think about assuming a leadership role in organizations that you find employment in. That is the end of the lecture. I will close there. As always, thank you for watching. Feel free to be in touch if you have any questions.